Petter Hornfeldt. A round of applause. Come over, and we are all yours. Go ahead.
Right. Can you all hear me okay? I'm not used to talking in front of this much people, so. First of all, thank you for coming here. It's a great honor to be here to talk in this conference. I want to talk a little bit about myself, my favorite subject. Who am I then? Well, my name is Petter Hornfeldt, obviously. I'm 42 years old. I have 2 sons, 1 wife, 2 dogs. And I've been working for the last 21 years as an airline pilot and the last 18 years as a type rating instructor and type rating examiner for a large European airline. And I also run a couple of YouTube channels, which is probably how most of you know me. This clicker, and this is just... Try now. There we go. So, what I'm going to talk about today is something that you are probably more or less aware of, but maybe you haven't seen the background to it fully and where it's heading and its potential implications when it comes to the safety of the airline business and for people working inside of it. So I want to take you through a bit of a journey, starting with where we were, then where we are right now, and then where we are eventually going. So I'm sorry if this is going to give a little bit of PTSD for those of you who are in the audience here. But if we look back to 2019, everything was looking great in the airline business by then. You know, all of the curves were pointing upwards. There was a feeling of that the industry was just going to continue to grow as it had done for many, many years up until that point. But there were a couple of worrying signs in there already. The terms and conditions for pilots and people working in the industry in general had been declining over the last 2 decades or so. The flight schools were starting to have a problem to find cadets to actually fill their courses. But everything was looking reasonably well back in 2019. I was actually here then. I've been here for, I think, 4 years in this conference, and 2019 was a pretty good year. But then, in February or so of 2020, there were starting to be these rumors flying around about this new disease that had popped up in Asia. And around that time, there was a big football match in Bergamo, between Bergamo and Valencia. And just prior to that football match, the first locally transmitted version of COVID-19 had been identified. And of course, after that game, a lot of supporters were in Bergamo. That's where it kind of started up. And then these people went from Bergamo back to Spain, which is kind of where all of the COVID-19 started in Europe. Now, I was working as a type rating examiner at the time. We have a simulator center in Bergamo, and I came to work once this had all started. And I was met by this for the first time in my life. Empty streets, empty malls, no people anywhere. And I don't think that we understood the kind of impact that this would eventually have on the industry that we know and love. But of course, what followed was the biggest dip in aviation history. Much bigger than anyone could have an idea of when it happened. I was put on the ground for 3 months or so, in complete lockdown in Spain, but similar things happened, of course, all over Europe and all over the globe. Now, because of that unprecedented crisis in the industry, there was a lot of, after a while, the states started realizing that the airlines need some help to stay afloat. So some airlines got a lot of state-funded help, but the same didn't happen to the flight schools. So a lot of the flight training infrastructure around Europe and around the world actually started to really struggle during COVID. And this wasn't great, because as I explained before, already in 2019, there had been some issues for the flight training industry with finding cadets and so, but now all of a sudden, the whole world saw pilots that were sitting previously in the cockpit and now driving delivery trucks. And of course, the question then became, should I spend the kind of money that is needed to become a pilot when this can happen to me? This was not good for the flight training industry, not in Europe, not anywhere. But not only that, also me and my colleagues started to question, is this what we're going to do? Is this what can happen to us? If there's an outbreak of any kind, will we be put on the streets? So a lot of my generation of pilots actually started looking into, maybe I should look for a second career. And the pandemic also led to us reevaluating how we had been working. All of a sudden, things like spending time with your family, being home, being flexible, started becoming more important. So instead of being single-mindedly focused on being a pilot, becoming a pilot, and then staying as a pilot, a lot of pilots now started to kind of reconsider this idea a little bit. Okay? So on top of that, let's see, let's come to the next one here. What this all meant was a 20% total reduction in global training capacity. That's flight schools going bust, flight schools stopping operation completely. But on top of that, what also happened during the pandemic was that the state stimulus that was being sent out into the world, in the United States and Europe and so on, started to actually boost the stock markets, right? So the stock market started going up at the same time as people were starting to reevaluate becoming or staying pilots. And of course, if the stock market goes up, the pilots who are at the end of their career, the ones that are about to retire, they will see their retirement accounts going up. There's more and more money there. So a lot of people in the baby booming generation, the biggest generation that is out there, started maybe thinking about doing that pre-retirement thing that people were talking about, and they actually took it. Now, if you put all of these things together, you can see how this leads to the kind of pilot shortage that we're now starting to see the beginning of, because we are only in the beginning of it. So that brings us to where we are today. It turns out that the airline industry didn't go under during COVID. In fact, as soon as the airlines started flying again, people started traveling, and they started traveling like they had never done before. Because even though we were struggling, or even though we in the industry and the hotel industry and so on were struggling during COVID, a lot of people actually stayed home and continued to get their salaries and built up a lot of capital. So once people were allowed to start to travel again, they did so, and they started to do so in big numbers. But this has led to this. So as you can see, even though we had a huge dip during 2020, 2021, 2022 as well, we're now back to where we were, almost 90 to 96%. These figures are from November last year. So right now we're probably past this. And as you can see, the curves all point in one direction. These curves, by the way, and all of this information is taken from AFM, who's helped me to put together this presentation. But what this all represents to us is that while the demand for pilots are rising right now and is going to continue to rise for the foreseeable future, the actual supply of pilots has gone down significantly. And you can all see what's happening out here today. If you were here last year, you would have seen a much smaller gathering of people. Today it's much bigger. There's a lot of demand out there. There are more airlines out here now than it's ever been. And that is because we are seeing the effects of this. Obviously, this is not just me guessing. This is happening right now. We're seeing the biggest effects of the pilot shortage starting up in North America, mainly, where, for example, Piedmont Airlines started off with giving up to $100,000 in sign-up bonuses to certain pilots. We're seeing the biggest salary increases on record for the majors in the US. And we're also seeing up to 500 of their aircraft standing parked on the ground because they don't have pilots enough to fly them. Now, US is a little bit of a special case because they also have the 1,500-hour rule, which is restricting supply even more. But of course, the airlines will not stand for that, right? They will want to keep their aircraft flying. So what they're doing now is they're starting to poach pilots from Australia, for example. They're issuing new visas to Australian pilots to come and fly in the US. They're trying to get their people home from the Middle Eastern airlines, and those airlines will then start to poach pilots from Europe, from the rest of the world. So we are starting to see this now, and it's going to come with consequences. On the other hand, the flight training industry finds itself between a rock and a hard place. So, as I said, 20% of the training capacity has already disappeared because a lot of flight schools were founded, driven by pilots, active pilots, and they just couldn't afford to continue. That capacity has not yet gotten fully back, right? It's not back again. And on the other side, they're also finding themselves losing their most experienced flight instructors, because as the pilot shortage starts looming, of course, the flight instructors with experience are the first ones that are going to be poached by the airlines. So not only are the schools lacking, but there are not enough schools, but they're also lacking in instructors, and that's going to continue. Which brings us to where we are going from here. So according to FM data, we're going to need about 284,000 new pilots within the next decade or so. That's comprised by replacement to a certain extent of existing pilots. That's a big part because, like I said, the baby booming generation is going into retirement now. There's nothing that we can do about that. And as I also said, because of the pandemic, that had been accelerated. So in the pandemic, what the pandemic actually did was not so much hurt the industry. Well, of course, it hurt the industry, but it didn't do anything that wasn't already happening. It was an accelerator of things that were to come anyway. It now just happened quicker than we thought it would be. But apart from the 99,000 people that we need to replace, we also have 153,000 that is going to have to come as new pilots added to the industry because of just the orders that sits with Boeing and Airbus today. So, what do we need to do then? Well, I'm hoping that there are some airline executives sitting here today, because there's going to be a need for the airlines to become more directly involved in flight training from now on. Up until now, they have been living in a pretty solid and secured situation where the cadets would be coming to them, applying to them, and they would be able to point at which ones they wanted. But given the situation that I just explained to you, where they have already poached the best flight instructors, the most experienced flight instructors from the schools, the airlines are going to have to become more involved directly in training. And my suggestion would be for the airlines to work together with the flight schools that they trust and send down people from the mainland from the main line to actually instruct in the flight schools. There are plenty of great flight instructors in the airlines today that would love to do some general aviation flying and could come in and actually help to keep the quality of the training up in the flight schools. They also need to provide financial support for the students. Now, this is something that I have been talking about from the very beginning of when I was part of starting up the Airline Pilot Club, that I hope that you will see is here today as well. Until now, I think that the airline industry needs to start taking more responsibility for getting the right quality of people into the industry. And we have to just face the fact that the pilots or the people that could become the best pilots out there doesn't necessarily have 100,000 euros to pay for the training. So we need to find those people, and we need to help them to get through the training. And that will lie on top of the airlines, because the airlines are the ones that are going to use these pilots to make money. What the airlines also are going to have to do is establish robust SOPs, standard operating procedures. This is the case in every airline that is used to doing cadet training up until now, because standard operating procedures is the only thing that a new cadet can hold on to when they don't have the experience. So for older airlines that are not used to doing this is going to be new territory for them. But robust, detailed standard operating procedures is going to be a must. They're also going to, if they haven't already, establish effective safety management systems. So what does that mean now? Well, they need to encourage people and create an atmosphere within the airline that encourages people to report things that they see is going wrong. So if they see that there is a trend about something happening, or if anyone is making a mistake, they need to feel that they are secure in being able to report this, and the airline need to take it seriously and look into it. Because we will start to see trends now, especially in airlines that are not used to taking in relatively unexperienced pilots, of new issues starting to arise, and we need to find those issues, and we need to fix those issues before they become a real safety threat. And that, of course, brings us to the next point, which is create world-class training organizations. Again, airlines that are used to doing cadet training already have world-class training organizations, but this is going to have to spread through the entire industry. So don't take good training for granted. Actively work against creating it. And ultimately, as we start to go towards the end of this cycle, where there are very few pilots and the airlines are going to have to try to convince those pilots to come and work for them, this is going to become even more important. This is working to improve lifestyle terms and conditions. That doesn't mean that they have to pay less. It just means that the lifestyle terms and conditions are the things that are going to keep people staying within those airlines and not go to another airline. And I talk from my own experience here that lifestyle is everything. Being able to stay in an airline that looks after you, takes care of you, looks after your family is what makes the biggest difference. Providing support for flight schools, I've already mentioned actually. This is what I was talking about before, about potentially sending down instructors down into the flight schools that they're working with. I really believe that that's going to be super important going forward. So, there we go. What about us then? What do we have to do, us pilots? Well, we of course need to respect and follow these standard operating procedures that the airlines put in place. And that might sound like, obviously, Petter, of course you have to do that. But this again goes to airlines with pilots who might not be used to working with cadets and might be used to doing things their own way. If we are to work together, if really, really experienced pilots have to work with really inexperienced pilots, these standard operating procedures and following them to the letter is going to be absolutely crucial for the operation to be able to continue and function well. And it also means that the pilots need to participate in the safety management system. So it's no good if the airline put in place a reporting system if the pilots are not reporting what they see. And of course, that means that you need to trust the airline. You need to trust that if you make a mistake and you report it, you're not going to be punished for it. So it's a combination here. But working together, this is what made aviation as safe as it is today. The safety management systems and the way that we work together and report and look at things, this is the secret sauce that keeps the aviation industry as safe as it is. And we need to continue working on that. We also need to establish peer support and mentorship programs. So peer support programs became extremely important after COVID when a lot of my colleagues were struggling. Like the industry was struggling throughout and there was a lot of people with financial difficulties and so on. But it was obvious that we needed to reach out and help each other. But also mentorship programs I think is going to be super important. That means that older, more experienced pilots like myself, like my colleagues, maybe gets assigned 5 new pilots that have just entered the company, which they can just call up, go out, have a cup of coffee with, discuss how things actually work in the industry, and help people along to establish, to kind of bridge the experience gap. We also need to work constructively together with companies and unions. So what do I mean by this? I did this presentation first up in Iceland together with Icelandair. And that was actually arranged by the unions. So they started to kind of turn around a little bit when I said this. But what I mean by this is that the kind of salaries that we're seeing, for example, in the United States now, where an airline captain can get $600,000-700,000 per year, is likely not sustainable long term. There's always a chance that when you see a shortage, that you're going to try to take advantage of it and go a little bit further than you should. Now, the problem with doing that in a long term, it's a little bit, it can be a little bit like peeing in your pants when it's cold outside. Right? It's super nice for the first couple of minutes, but it's really bad after a few minutes after that. What I mean by that is that, of course, what we also have on the horizon are things like single pilot systems, which if the pilot shortage becomes too big of a problem, that's when we really will start to see a push within the industry for single pilot systems. And we don't want that, because it's stupid. So, what should we do together then? Well, I think that we, both the airline industry and also us pilots, obviously, on the individual initiatives, should start talking about outreach programs. This means reaching down into schools at a young age to explain to people what we do in our industry, why it's so great to work as an engineer, as a flight attendant, as a pilot. We need to start actively showing people that this is a potential career path for everyone, right? Whilst it has been traditionally dominated by, well, male-dominated, 94-95%, we cannot do that anymore. We need to reach all people out there, all potentially talented, great pilots that are out there who haven't even thought about this as a possibility. But what is even more important than that is that throughout this, no matter what it is that we do, the standards must remain. We cannot allow this potential pilot shortage to lower the standards of pilots, pilot training, people working in the industry. We need to increase that standard. And the only way that we do that is being able to reach out to 100% of the available pool of potential pilots. That's why we need financial support. That's why we need to reach out to people at lower ages. That's why we need to show why this industry is as wonderful as it is. And that's me, basically.
Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. You started ahead of time, finished ahead of time, a role model in the airline industry. And now we have some time for questions.
Absolutely.
Anyone? Yes, over there.
Yeah, thanks, Petter. Marek Musial. I'm not from aviation. I'm working at automotive safety currently, so it might sound as a stupid question here. You talked about standard operating procedures a couple of times, and I have already been wondering before, like, why is it really necessary that they differ so much from airline to airline, and what are your thoughts? Could it maybe help with respect to safety and with respect to recruitment, possibly to change this in some way?
So the standard operating procedures tend to differ between airlines for a lot of different reasons. Generally, it's because the airline has brought with it standard operating procedures from several different aircraft types, or that it has a history where these standard operating procedures have kind of evolved through time. And I agree with you. If we're working in a world where pilots are moving in between airlines, which we already are, and we're going to get even further into that, the more standardized the standard operating procedures are globally, the better it is. And it is going that way. Boeing standard, for example, like if you're flying a 737, there is a Boeing standard SOP, and you can see airlines adopting more and more of that, pushing more towards that. But there will always be some differences. But I completely agree. The more standardized we are, the safer it is.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Anyone else? Ah, there we go.